she didn't call. She texted. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the words themselves, though the words were bad enough. It was the fact that she couldn't be bothered to pick up the phone. 31 years and I got a text message. Dad, we've decided it's better if you're not at the ceremony. We want to keep it intimate. Hope you understand. I read it twice. Then I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter, the way you set something down when you don't trust your own hands. I made coffee. I stood by the window and watched the neighbor's dog dig at the frost in the backyard next door. A magpie landed on the fence post, looked around like it owned the place, then flew off. I drank my coffee. I didn't reply. That was a Tuesday morning in late October. The kind of morning where the sky over Edmonton can't decide if it's going to snow or just threaten you with it for another 6 weeks. The trees had already given up their leaves. Everything was bare and waiting. My daughter was getting married on Saturday, and I had just been uninvited. I should back up, because this story doesn't start with a text message. It starts the way most of these things start, slowly, quietly, with a man who keeps telling himself everything is fine. My wife passed away 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the end, and she was gone before our daughter had finished her second year of university. Her name was Frances, and she was the kind of woman who kept a handwritten list of everyone's birthdays tucked inside her wallet. She never missed one. Not a cousin, not a colleague, not the man who delivered our mail for 12 years and once mentioned in passing that his birthday was in March. After Frances, I was on my own. My daughter, she was 21 then, was at school in Calgary. My son was already working in Vancouver, had been there since his mid-20s. I was in the house in Edmonton where we'd raised both of them, and I rattled around in it for about 3 years before I figured out how to stop expecting Frances to walk through the front door. I'm a retired civil engineer, 40 years with the provincial government, mostly infrastructure, bridges, drainage systems, the unglamorous work that nobody thinks about until something breaks. I'm good with plans. I'm good with load calculations and timelines and knowing which variables you can control and which ones you can't. I am not, as it turned out, particularly good at seeing my own family clearly. My daughter, I'll call her by what she called me, which is simply daughter, because that's all she's ever been to me and all she ever needed to be, met her now husband 6 years ago at a work conference in Banff. He works in finance. I won't go into all of it, but let's say he is the kind of man who talks about money the way other people talk about the weather. Constantly, casually, and with the assumption that everyone around him finds it equally fascinating. I tried. I want to be clear about that. I drove down to Calgary when she first introduced him. I took them both to dinner at a place on Stephen Avenue, a steak place she'd always liked. I asked him questions. I listened to his answers. I told myself that what mattered was that she was happy, and she seemed happy. So I kept my mouth shut about the things that made me uneasy. Things like the way he interrupted her when she was telling a story. Things like the way he looked at the bill when it came, and I could see him calculating, and then he smiled at me like it was a foregone conclusion that I'd be covering it. I covered it. I always covered it. Over the next 4 years, I covered a lot of things. There was the down payment on their condo. That was the first big one, $40,000, which I transferred without a second thought because my daughter called and said they'd found something perfect, but were just short. And Frances and I had always talked about helping the kids get started. I thought of it as Frances's wish as much as mine. I signed the transfer form at my credit union on a Wednesday afternoon, and the teller said, "That's very generous." And I said, "That's what parents do." Then there were the smaller things that added up to being not small at all. The trip to Portugal for their anniversary because he wanted something special, and they were a bit stretched that month. The new car when hers broke down, I told her I'd cover half, and then somehow it became 3/4. And then when the financing didn't come through, all of it. The engagement party at a private room at a restaurant in downtown Calgary that seated 40 people and cost more than my first car. I paid for the rehearsal dinner. I contributed significantly to the weddings itself, the venue, the catering deposit, the photographer. My son knew. He's the quiet one, always has been. He called me once from Vancouver, maybe 2 years into all this, and he said, "Dad, are you keeping track of what's going out?" And I said I was fine, that I wanted to do this, that his sister needed the support. He didn't push, but I could hear something in the pause before he said, "Okay, Dad," that I chose not to hear. Here is the thing I understand now that I didn't understand then. I wasn't being generous, I was being managed. I don't say that to be cruel about my daughter. I think she convinced herself, genuinely convinced herself, that what was happening was fine, that I had the money, that I wanted to help, that this was normal. I think she stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a resource. Not out of malice, but out of habit. And the habit had been forming for years, and I'd been letting it form because I didn't want to be the difficult father, the grieving man who made everything harder. I wanted to be useful. I wanted her to need me. I just didn't understand what I was agreeing to. The wedding planning started in earnest about 18 months before the ceremony. The venue was a property outside of Canmore, a private estate with mountain views, the kind of place that exists in Alberta, specifically to make you feel like you'd wandered into a magazine. It was, by any honest measure, more wedding than 2 people in their mid-30s needed. But it was what she wanted, and I said nothing, and I wrote the checks. Her future father-in-law, I'd met him twice by then, a man from Calgary who'd made money in commercial real estate, contributed almost nothing to the planning. That became clear early on. His contribution was a gift of cash to the couple, which I learned about only because my daughter mentioned it once in passing and then immediately changed the subject. The amount, as far as I can tell, was modest. The expectation that I would fill every other gap was not. I started noticing things changing about 8 months before the wedding. My daughter called less. When she did call, the conversations were shorter, more transactional. Updates about logistics, questions about what I was planning to wear, reminders about dates. There was a warmth missing that I kept telling myself was just stress. Planning a large event is stressful. I know this. I gave her every benefit of every doubt. Then came the seating chart conversation. She called on a Sunday in August. She said they'd been working on the seating arrangements and she wanted to talk it through. I said, of course. She told me the layout, who was sitting where, which tables were near the front, which were further back. She mentioned, almost in passing, that her future father-in-law would be seated at the head family table during the dinner. I waited for her to tell me where I'd be sitting. She didn't, I asked. There was a pause, not a long one, but long enough, and she said that they'd put me at a table with my son and some of the cousins, near the side. It was a lovely table, she said. A really lovely spot. I said that was fine. I said it the way I said most things in those months. Calmly, agreeably, swallowing whatever was rising in my chest and telling myself it wasn't worth making a fuss about. But I hung up that Sunday and I sat in my kitchen for a long time. And I thought about a man who had contributed a modest cash gift, who would be sitting at the head table. And I thought about $40,000, and Portugal, and the car, and the catering deposit, and every dinner I'd paid for on Stephen Avenue. And I thought, what exactly am I to this event? The answer, when the text came on that Tuesday morning in October, turned out to be optional. Dad, we've decided it's better if you're not at the ceremony. We want to keep it intimate. Hope you understand. I read it again that evening. I'd left it face down all day. I'd gone for a walk along the River Valley Trail. I've been walking since the kids were small. I'd had lunch at the diner on White Avenue, where Francis and I used to go on Saturday mornings. I sat in my usual spot, and the server, a young man who's been there for years, brought me my coffee without my asking, and I thought, without quite meaning to, at least someone knows what I take. I came home and I turned the phone over. I didn't reply to the text. Instead, I called my son. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he'd been waiting for the call, which told me he already knew. "She told you," I said. "She mentioned it," he said carefully. "When?" A pause. "Last week." I let that sit between us for a moment. My son knew for a week. My daughter had held the information like something she was trying to time correctly, and she'd landed on a text message on a Tuesday morning, 4 days before her wedding. "Okay," I said. "Dad." "I'm not angry," I said, and I surprised myself by meaning it. I wasn't angry. I was something quieter than that, something that had been a long time arriving. I just needed to know, "What are you going to do?" I looked around my kitchen, the house that Francis and I bought in 1987, the house where both children came home from the hospital, the house where my daughter learned to ride a bike in the backyard, and my son built a model of the Confederation Bridge for a school project on the dining room table. The house I had been maintaining, quietly, for 31 years. "I'm going to make some calls," I said. "I want to be very clear about something." I did not act in anger. "I want you to understand that because I think it matters." What I did slowly and carefully over the next 3 days. I made a list. I reviewed my accounts. I spoke to my financial advisor, a woman I've worked with for over 15 years who has an office in the West End, and who once told Francis that she wished all her clients were as straightforward as us. I laid out the situation. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What do you want to do?" I told her. The first thing I did was contact the catering company. I had paid the final balance on the catering deposit 6 weeks earlier, a significant amount, as these things go. I explained that I was withdrawing my contribution to the event and asked about the refund policy. There was a clause in the contract I'd signed, a clause my daughter had asked me to sign, in my name, because it simplified the billing, that allowed for partial withdrawal of the sponsoring party's contribution up to 72 hours before the event. My financial advisor had found it. I was within the window. I received a partial refund. Then I called the photographer. Same situation. I had paid for the photography package outright as a wedding gift. I explained that the gift was being rescinded and asked about their cancellation policy. They were apologetic but professional. A portion of the booking fee was non-refundable, which I accepted. The remainder came back to me. I did not touch the venue. That contract was in my daughter's name, and I was simply a contributor. That wasn't my place to interfere with. But here is the thing about the condo. The condo had been purchased with my $40,000 contribution as part of the down payment. I had never formalized this as a gift. I hadn't done it because I trusted her, and because Francis would have trusted her, and because at the time it hadn't occurred to me to do anything else. But I had kept every record, every transfer confirmation, every email exchange where the arrangement was discussed. I called my lawyer. He's a friend as much as a professional. We've known each other since our kids were in the same minor hockey league in the 90s. And he's the kind of man who tells you the truth without enjoying it. I explained what had been given and what had happened. He told me about a few options. He told me that recovering the sum outright would be a long and painful process, and probably wasn't worth what it would cost, financially, emotionally, relationally. He advised against it, but he also helped me draft a letter, a formal letter, on his letterhead, laying out the contributions I had made over the course of the relationship, totaling them, and stating clearly that these contributions were made with the expectation of a familial relationship conducted in good faith, and that I was placing the letter on record with his office. I didn't send it yet. I just had it prepared. Then I called my bank and I restructured my estate planning. My will had been written when the children were young, dividing everything equally. I sat with my financial advisor and we updated the beneficiary designations on my registered accounts, my TFSA, my pension survivor provisions. I didn't remove my daughter, I'm not that man, and I don't think Francis would recognize me if I were. But I clarified intentions. I added conditions. I documented everything. The house, the one in Edmonton, the one Francis and I bought in 1987. I'd been thinking about selling for 2 years anyway. It was too large for one person. The maintenance was becoming more than I wanted to manage, and I'd looked at some townhouse properties near the river valley that made a certain kind of sense. I called the realtor I'd been meaning to call. She came by on Thursday morning and we walked through the place, and she gave me a number and I said, let's proceed. The listing went up on Friday. My daughter was married on Saturday. I wasn't there. I'll tell you what I did instead. I drove to Jasper. I've been going to Jasper since before my children were born. Francis and I went on our third date to a little inn near Pyramid Lake that has since been renovated beyond recognition. But I still go back to the same area out of habit and something that isn't quite memory but is close enough. I'd booked 2 nights at a small lodge. Nothing fancy, the kind of place with a wood-burning fireplace in the common room, and a breakfast that arrives at 7:30 whether you asked for it or not. I arrived Friday evening. I ate dinner at the lodge. I had a glass of scotch by the fire. I went to bed early. Saturday morning I woke up before the sun came up and I drove out to a viewpoint I've known since my 30s, and I sat in my truck and watched the light come into the mountains. It was cold, properly cold, the way Jasper gets in late October, the kind of cold that doesn't ask permission. I had a thermos of coffee. I watched the light move across the peaks. I thought about Francis. I thought about my son, who had called on Friday night to check on me, who had said quietly, "I'm proud of you, Dad," in a way that told me he'd been wanting to say something like it for a while. I thought about my daughter, not with bitterness, or not only with bitterness. I thought about her the way you think about someone you've loved without reservation for decades, someone who is still your child even when they've done something that takes your breath away. I thought, she is going to call eventually. I thought, when she does, I will answer. But it will not be the same conversation. She called 11 days later. I was back in Edmonton by then, already in the process of moving things around in the house in preparation for the realtor's showings. I was packing books. I have a lot of books, another thing Francis and I had in common, when my phone rang. I looked at the screen. I set the book I was holding on the shelf. I answered, "Dad." Her voice was tight, not the voice of someone who is angry. The voice of someone who has realized something and isn't sure yet how to be with that realization. "Hi," I said. "I got a call from the catering company." "Okay. And from Marcus, the photographer." A pause. "Dad, what did you do?" "I withdrew my contributions," I said. "I was within the cancellation windows on both contracts." Silence. "You weren't at the wedding, no?" I said. "I wasn't." "I thought." She stopped. Started again. "I thought you understood. About keeping it intimate." I put down the box tape I'd been holding. I sat down on the living room floor, surrounded by half-packed boxes. "Sweetheart," I said, and I meant the word. I have always meant it. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about your answer before you give it." She didn't say anything. "Do you know how much money I've contributed to your life with him over the past 4 years?" Silence. "I'm not asking you to pay it back," I said. "I'm not asking for anything. I just want to know if you know the number." "Dad, I don't think this is about." "The down payment on the condo was $40,000, I said. "The car was 22. The Portugal trip was roughly 6,000. The engagement party was 9. The catering deposit alone was 14. I'm not remembering all of it, but my financial advisor helped me add it up. It was well over $100,000 over 4 years. Another silence. "Do you know what your other grandfather contributed to the wedding planning?" She said his name. She didn't say an amount. "I know," I said. "He gave you a card with a check in it, which is a perfectly reasonable and kind thing to do. And he sat at the head table, and I was asked not to come." I heard her breathing. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel terrible," I said. I'm telling you this because I think somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me. Not intentionally. I don't think you sat down and decided to take me for granted. I think it just became the shape of things. And I let it, because I wanted to be useful to you, and I confused being useful with being loved. Dad, I do love you. I know you do, I said. And I believed it. That was the complicated part. I believed it completely. But love that only shows up when there's a gap to fill isn't the kind of love I'm going to keep reorganizing my life around. I'm 63 years old. Your mother has been gone for 11 years. I've been showing up quietly for a long time, and I'm not doing it quietly anymore. She started to cry. The sound of it moved through me the way it always has. She's been my daughter since the moment she was born. And that doesn't switch off, not even when you're sitting on the floor of your living room surrounded by moving boxes, making a point that needed to be made. I didn't think you'd actually not come, she said. I know, I said gently. That's the part you need to think about. There's a mediation that happens in these situations, not a formal one, not lawyers in a room, just the long, slow work of people trying to figure out how to be with each other after something breaks. Her husband called me about a week later. I'll give him this, he called, which I didn't expect, and he didn't lead with defensiveness, which I respected. He said he wanted to understand what had happened. I told him I was happy to explain. I told him what I had given and what I had observed, and I told him that I had no interest in punishing anyone, but I also had no interest in returning to an arrangement where I was expected to be generous and nothing more. He listened. He asked a few questions. Then, he said something I've thought about since. He said he hadn't known the full extent of what I'd contributed, because my daughter had handled the finances between us. I don't know if that's entirely true, but I noted it. My son flew in from Vancouver the following month. We spent a weekend together, just the two of us, took a drive out to the Badlands, had dinner in Drumheller, talked for the better part of 6 hours over 2 days. He told me things he'd been carrying for years. I told him things I should have said out loud much earlier. It was the kind of conversation you can only have when enough has finally happened that the politeness drops away. You taught me to carry my own weight, he said at one point, sitting at a diner table in Drumheller with a cup of terrible coffee going cold between his hands. I always wondered why it seemed like the same rule didn't apply to everyone. I was softer with her because I was afraid, I said. Of what? Of her not needing me. He looked at me for a moment. She needed you too much, Dad. That's different. He was right. He usually is, even when I don't want him to be. The house sold in December. 3 showings, 1 offer, clean conditions, closing in the new year. I found a townhouse near Mill Creek, walking distance to the river valley, 2 bedrooms, a small patio where I intend to grow tomatoes with probably limited success. I've been here 3 months now, and it's beginning to feel like mine. My daughter and I are speaking. Carefully, cautiously, the way you speak to someone after you've both said things that can't be unsaid, and you're deciding together whether the foundation is still solid. She came to Edmonton in February. Just her, without her husband. We had lunch at the diner on White Avenue. She sat across from me and she looked like herself again, not the managed, polished version of herself I'd been seeing for 4 years. She said she was sorry, not in the way people apologize when they want the subject changed. She said it slowly, like she'd been preparing it, like she meant every syllable. She said she had spent weeks trying to put together the full picture of what had happened, and that when she finally did, she didn't like what she saw. I told her that was enough, that I didn't need a full accounting, that I needed to know she'd seen it. She said she'd seen it. We split the bill. I noticed because she insisted, and I let her. It was a small thing. It mattered. I'm not a man who believes in keeping score. I want to be clear about that. I spent 40 years calculating load-bearing variables for a living, and I learned that the structures most likely to fail are the ones where all the weight is being carried by a single point. That's not good engineering. That's not a good family either. What I did in those days after the text message, making the calls, restructuring the accounts, going to Jasper, I didn't do to punish anyone. I did it because I finally understood that the structure I'd been holding up by myself wasn't going to change unless something shifted. And the only thing I had control over was what I was willing to carry. I'm 63. My knees ache in the cold. I walk the river valley most mornings and I think about Francis and I think about the bridge I helped design over a creek up north somewhere that will probably outlast everyone reading this. I think about my son, who calls on Sunday evenings and always asks how I'm doing and means it. I think about my daughter, who is finding her way back to me, slowly, which is the right pace. I think about a text message on a Tuesday morning in October, and a man standing at a kitchen window watching a magpie land on a fence post and fly away. I think, I'm still standing here, I think. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot.